You are standing at the edge of a dying forest. The trees are thinning, the fruit that was here last season isn't here anymore, the roots are harder to find. The group behind you hasn't eaten properly in 3 days, and 2 of the children are quiet in a way that worries you. Somewhere out ahead, something large and slow is moving through the grass. You have never eaten anything like it before. You have never tried. But you are about to make a decision that will echo for 300,000 years. You don't know that. You're just hungry. And that is how the human diet changed forever. Not with a plan, not with a discovery, but with a moment of hunger so complete that the old rules simply stopped applying. We talk about the shift to meat eating as though it was inevitable, as though early humans looked at the animals around them, weighed the nutritional data, and made a sensible dietary adjustment, as though at some point our ancestors simply decided that plants weren't cutting it anymore and upgraded. That story is wrong, and not just slightly wrong. Wrong in a way that completely changes how you understand what humans are, where we came from, and why the world looks the way it does today. Because the real story of how ancient humans stopped being vegetarians is not a story about progress. It is a story about catastrophe, adaptation, and a species cornered by circumstances into becoming something it had never been before. And the consequences of that moment, that specific, desperate, unremarkable moment at the edge of a contracting forest, are still running through your body right now, whether you had a salad for lunch or a steak. Let's start with something that tends to get glossed over. For a very long time, our ancestors weren't hunters. They weren't even particularly interested in being hunters. The earliest members of our genus, the hominins who walked upright, used simple tools, lived in social groups, subsisted primarily on plants, fruit, leaves, roots, tubers, seeds, nuts. The occasional insect, an egg when one could be found. This was not a failure of imagination or ambition. It was a perfectly functional survival strategy that had worked for millions of years across dozens of primate lineages, including the ancestors we share with chimpanzees and gorillas. Plants are reliable. They don't run away. They don't fight back. They don't require coordination, risk, or the kind of sustained physical effort that burns more calories than it produces on a bad day. For a species with a large brain and a relatively fragile body, plants were, from a pure energy accounting perspective, an excellent choice. The evidence for this early plant-dominated diet comes from multiple directions. Fossilized teeth from early Australopithecus species, our predecessors walking the African landscape between 4 and 2 million years ago, show wear patterns consistent with a diet of hard plant material. Seeds, roots, tough vegetation. The enamel is thick, the molars are broad, the jaw structure is built for grinding rather than tearing. These are not the teeth of a predator. They are the teeth of something that spent most of its day processing vegetation. Carbon isotope analysis from ancient bones tells a similar story. The ratio of different carbon isotopes preserved in fossil bone reflects what an animal ate during its lifetime. And for early hominins, those ratios point overwhelmingly toward plant foods. Not exclusively, not rigidly, but predominantly, consistently, across millions of years of the fossil record. Here is where it gets interesting. The question most people ask is, when did ancient humans start eating meat? But that's actually the wrong question. A more precise and far more revealing question is, when did meat become a significant, reliable, intentional part of the human diet, and what made that happen? Because those are two very different thresholds. Opportunistic scavenging, picking meat off a carcass that something else killed, appears in the archaeological record surprisingly early. Cut marks on animal bones dated to around 3.4 million years ago in Ethiopia suggest that hominins were using sharp stones to remove meat from bones long before anyone would describe them as hunters. But occasional scavenging is not the same as hunting. It is not the same as actively pursuing killing and processing large animals as a dietary strategy. The gap between those two behaviors is enormous, and crossing it required something more than hunger. It required a specific kind of pressure, and that pressure came from the sky. Around 2.5 million years ago, Earth's climate entered a period of dramatic instability. Global temperatures fluctuated. Ice sheets expanded. The African continent, which had previously supported vast stretches of dense tropical forest, began to dry. The forests contracted. Grasslands expanded in their place. And this shift, this slow, grinding, centuries-long transformation of the landscape, fundamentally changed what was available to eat. The fruit, Leaves and roots that had sustained hominin populations for millions of years became harder to find, more spread out, less predictable. The reliable caloric foundation that had made a plant-based diet so practical began to erode. And at the same time, those expanding grasslands filled up with something new: large herds of grazing animals, wildebeest, antelope, ancient horses, giant bovids, enormous quantities of protein and fat, moving slowly across open ground. The landscape was simultaneously removing the old food source and replacing it with a new one. The only problem was that the new food source was fast, dangerous, and completely unlike anything our ancestors had ever tried to eat before. This is the moment that everything hinges on. Not a discovery, not an invention, not a cultural decision. A slow structural crisis that left a group of highly social, moderately intelligent, physically unimpressive bipeds staring across a grassland full of animals they had no established framework for eating, while the forests behind them quietly disappeared. What they did next was not heroic. It was not a triumph of human ingenuity. It was, initially, profoundly humbling. They scavenged. They followed the real predators, the lions, the leopards, the hyenas, and waited. When the kill was made and the predator had eaten its fill, when the hyenas had moved in for their share, when the scene had settled into the particular stillness that follows a large animal's death, the hominins moved in. They grabbed what was left. They used sharp-edged stones, the earliest stone tools, the Alduin industry, to crack open bones and extract the marrow that the carnivores couldn't reach. They scraped meat from joints. They ate quickly, nervously, one eye always on the tree line. This is not a flattering image, but it is, as far as the evidence suggests, an accurate one. We began our relationship with meat, not as apex predators, but as very clever, very anxious scavengers at the edge of someone else's kill. And yet, something important was happening inside those scavenging hominin bodies, even as they crouched nervously over borrowed carcasses. They were getting access to something their plant-based diet had never reliably provided: fat. Animal fat in particular. The dense, calorie-rich lipids stored in bone marrow and around the organs of large grazing animals is extraordinarily valuable to a large brain species. The human brain is metabolically expensive. It consumes roughly 20% of the body's total energy budget while accounting for only 2% of body weight. Maintaining that brain requires a consistent supply of high-quality calories that early hominin plant diets, especially in a contracting forest environment, were increasingly struggling to provide. Bone marrow is around 90% fat. It is one of the most calorie-dense foods available in a pre-agricultural landscape. And here is what the fossil record begins to show. Slowly, and then with increasing clarity, as the scavenging behavior becomes more consistent. Brain size increases, the hominin skull gets larger, the neural architecture gets more complex. The connection between the shift toward animal foods and the expansion of hominin brain size is not proven to be purely causal. These things are always more complicated than a single cause and effect, but the correlation is striking, consistent, and has been noted by researchers across multiple disciplines for decades. We may have literally thought our way to bigger brains by eating the right things at the right moment in our evolutionary history, and we may have found those things not through planning or intelligence, but through desperation and opportunism. But scavenging has limits. It is unreliable. It puts you in direct competition with animals that are much better equipped for violence than you are. A group of hominins trying to claim a carcass from a clan of Pleistocene-spotted hyenas is not a group that is going to win that confrontation on physical terms. Scavenging as a long-term dietary strategy requires either extraordinary luck or extraordinary boldness, and neither is sustainable indefinitely. At some point, and the archaeological record makes it frustratingly difficult to pinpoint exactly when, the balance began to shift. Hominins stopped waiting for other predators to do the killing. They started doing it themselves. The transition to active hunting is written into stone, literally. The development of Acheulean hand axes, symmetrical, carefully shaped tools that appear in the record around 1.7 million years ago, represents a quantum leap in cognitive complexity over the earlier Oldo and flake tools. Making an Acheulean hand axe requires holding a three-dimensional final form in mind, while working backward from a raw stone to produce it. It requires planning. It requires the ability to model a future state that doesn't yet exist. That same cognitive capacity, the ability to model things that aren't currently visible, is exactly what hunting requires. You cannot successfully hunt a large animal without understanding its behavior, anticipating its movement, and coordinating action with other hunters over time. The tool and the hunting strategy are expressions of the same underlying cognitive development. They appear together in the record because they are, in a fundamental sense, the same thing, wearing different forms. The wooden spears found at Schöningen in Germany, dated to around 300,000 years ago, are the most direct evidence of deliberate engineered hunting weapons from this period. These were not sharpened sticks. They were aerodynamically designed projectiles, heavier at the front for balance, crafted with a clear understanding of how a thrown object moves through air. Whoever made these had thrown enough things at enough targets to develop intuitions about trajectory and impact that we would now call applied physics. They were hunters, not scavengers. The archaeological sites associated with these spears show evidence of large-scale animal kills, horses primarily, in significant numbers. This is not opportunism. This is organized, premeditated predation. Something fundamental had changed. Here is where the story gets genuinely strange and genuinely important. The shift to active hunting didn't just change what ancient humans ate. It changed almost everything else about how they lived. Think about what hunting a large animal actually requires. You need to coordinate with other people. Hunting alone is possible, but hunting in groups is dramatically more efficient and dramatically safer. You need to share information about animal behavior, territory, movement patterns, seasonal changes. You need to plan ahead, scouting locations, preparing weapons, deciding when and where to move. You need to divide labor. Some people track, some people drive the animal, some people make the kill, some people process the carcass. And then you need to share the results because a single large animal produces far more meat than any individual or small family group can consume before it spoils, and wasting it is a catastrophic inefficiency in an environment where calories are survival. Hunting didn't just feed ancient humans, it restructured their entire social architecture. The requirements of cooperative predation, planning, communication, coordination, reciprocity are precisely the requirements that drive the development of more sophisticated language, more complex social bonds, more elaborate divisions of labor, and more intricate systems of exchange and obligation. When researchers try to identify the evolutionary pressures that pushed human social complexity so far beyond any other primate, cooperative hunting is consistently near the top of the list. We didn't just start eating animals. We organized our entire society around the act of eating animals. And that organization made us smarter, more communicative, more socially sophisticated, which in turn made us better hunters, which in turn restructured our societies further. It became a feedback loop, and the loop ran for hundreds of thousands of years. There is something else that tends to get left out of this story, and it has to do with fire. The controlled use of fire appears in the hominin record at least 1 million years ago, possibly earlier. And while the obvious benefits of fire are warmth, light, and protection from predators, the dietary implications are staggering and consistently underappreciated. Cooking meat changes it fundamentally. It breaks down the tough connective tissue that makes raw meat difficult to chew and digest. It kills pathogens that would otherwise cause serious illness. It pre-digests proteins in ways that make them significantly more bioavailable to the human gut. A cooked piece of meat delivers meaningfully more usable calories than the same piece of meat eaten raw. Anthropologist Richard Wrangham has argued extensively that cooking, not just meat eating, but the combination of meat eating and fire, is the single most important technological development in human prehistory, more significant in its physiological effects than any other innovation until the agricultural revolution. When you cook meat, you extract more energy from it. More energy means less time needed to eat and digest. Modern humans spend far less time chewing than any other great ape, and the difference maps almost precisely onto the introduction of cooking. Less time chewing means more time for everything else. More time for tool-making, social interaction, exploring, learning, teaching. Fire didn't just cook food, it cooked time. It freed up hours in the human day that had previously been consumed by the sheer mechanical labor of processing raw plant material and tough, uncooked animal tissue. And what did early humans do with those hours? They talked. They organized. They planned. They became, in ways that compound on each other across generations, increasingly human. Now let's talk about something that tends to make people uncomfortable, because this story does not end cleanly. The transition to a meat-inclusive diet was not a straightforward upgrade. It came with costs that our ancestors couldn't see and couldn't have anticipated. And some of those costs have followed us all the way to the present. The most immediate cost was risk. Hunting large animals is dangerous. Pleistocene megafauna, the mammoths, cave bears, aurochs, and giant bovids that early humans were eventually hunting at scale were not passive participants in their own death. Archaeological sites show evidence of hominin bones alongside the animals they were hunting. The hunt killed people regularly. The social structures that developed around cooperative hunting also introduced new forms of conflict over territory, over resources, over the distribution of meat. The archaeological record of the Upper Paleolithic is not entirely peaceful. Competition over hunting grounds between groups left marks in the fossil record that are not ambiguous. The shift to meat-eating intensified intergroup competition in ways that the plant-foraging lifestyle had never quite managed. But the deepest and most consequential cost was not paid by the hunters, it was paid by the landscape. Wherever early modern humans spread, out of Africa and into Eurasia, across the land bridges into the Americas, across the ocean to Australia, the large animals disappeared. The timing is, in every case, uncomfortable. North America's mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, American horses, and short-faced bears were gone within 2,000 years of human arrival. Australia's megafauna, animals that had survived every ice age and volcanic winter the planet had thrown at them for millions of years, collapsed within a few thousand years of the first Australians stepping ashore. These animals had never encountered a predator that could plan, coordinate, use projectile weapons, and transmit hunting strategies across generations. They had no behavioral adaptation for what was coming. They had no fear response calibrated for the specific threat profile of a group of humans with spears and fire, and the cognitive capacity to learn an entire species' habits and use that knowledge against it. They simply ran out of time to learn. The most successful dietary adaptation in hominin history, the shift that fed the brain growth, the social complexity, the technological innovation, the population expansion that eventually took our species to every corner of the planet, was also one of the most destructive ecological events of the past 100,000 years. The same cognitive capacities that made us effective hunters, made us, without any malicious intent and without any awareness of what we were doing, extraordinarily effective at eliminating species that had existed for millions of years. We didn't know. We were just hungry, and we had finally gotten very, very good at doing something about it. Here is the part of this story that stays with you. You carry the entire arc of it in your body right now. The craving for fat and protein that feels hardwired because it is. The satisfaction that comes from a meal with meat in it that is qualitatively different from the satisfaction of a plant-based meal. That difference is real. It is biological. And it is the legacy of hundreds of thousands of years of evolutionary pressure selecting for ancestors who sought out those foods with urgency. The social rituals around meat, the barbecue, the feast, the shared roast, are not arbitrary cultural inventions. They are the echo of a social architecture built around cooperative hunting and the communal sharing of a kill. When you sit around a fire with people you care about and eat meat together, you are doing something your ancestors did for so long and under such consistent pressure that it worked its way into the structure of how your brain registers belonging and safety and enough. That is not nostalgia, that is biology running ancient software on modern hardware. And at the same time, and this is the part that requires holding two things at once, the ecological cost of that ancient transition is not ancient history. The same appetite scaled by 8 billion people and industrialized into systems that the hominin who cracked that first marrow bone could not begin to imagine is now the single largest driver of land use, water use, greenhouse gas emissions, and biodiversity loss on the planet. The desperate dietary shift made at the edge of a contracting forest, made by a frightened group of people trying to keep their children alive through a climate crisis, has been running on a feedback loop for 2.5 million years. It made us who we are. It made us capable of building everything we have built. And it has brought us, with a kind of terrible logic, to a moment not entirely unlike the one where it started. The climate is shifting again, the landscape is changing, and a species that has always under pressure found a way to adapt is trying to figure out what adaptation looks like, this time not at the edge of a contracting forest, but at the edge of a contracting window. The ancestor standing in that dying forest didn't have a plan. They had hunger and they had each other, and they had a brain just capable enough to try something it had never tried before. That was enough. The question that belongs to us, the question that follows naturally from everything that desperate, unremarkable, world-altering moment set in motion, is whether the same combination is still enough now. Let me know in the comments what you want me to cover next. See you soon.